I don't know why I agreed to stay in that cabin. Looking back, every part of it was a mistake. But at the time, it seemed like a good way to get away from everything. A friend of a friend had mentioned a cheap rental in the middle of nowhere. An old hunting cabin, built solid but barely used anymore. No neighbors, no cell service, just endless trees and silence. Exactly what I thought I needed. It was late fall, the air cold but not freezing. The leaves had already turned, covering the forest floor in reds, oranges, and browns. It was the kind of place people went to clear their heads, to get away from the noise of the world. That's what I told myself I was doing. The drive took me almost 5 hours. The last hour of it was down a narrow dirt road, the kind that felt like it hadn't been touched in years. Deep ruts, scattered rocks, overgrown branches scraping against my truck. I almost turned around when I saw how bad the road was, but I had already come this far. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, small and weathered but sturdy. A single-story structure with a sagging porch, dark windows, and a rusted metal roof. A woodpile sat against the side, stacked high and dry. The forest surrounded it completely, dense and thick, stretching for miles in every direction. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of my truck was the silence. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt and the distant creaking of trees. I stood there for a minute, letting it sink in, before grabbing my bags and heading inside. The inside was basic but functional. A single room with a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, a bed, and a table with 2 chairs. A door led to a tiny bathroom with an old toilet and a shower that barely worked. It smelled like dust and wood smoke, but it was warm, and I had everything I needed. I spent the first few hours settling in, chopping some wood for the stove, and making sure everything worked. The cabin had a generator, but I planned to use it as little as possible. I wanted the quiet, the simplicity, just me and the woods. As the sun went down, I built a fire in the stove and sat by the small window, watching the trees. The sky turned a deep orange before fading into black, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Then I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the woods settling, branches snapping under the weight of the cold night. But the sound didn't stop. It was steady, rhythmic, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the trees just beyond the clearing. I turned off the lantern and moved to the window, staring into the dark. The fire inside made it hard to see anything outside, but I felt it. Presence. Something just beyond my line of sight. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice. It sounded human, almost, but there was something off about it. The way it carried through the trees, too clear, too sharp, like it was trying too hard to sound normal. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The woods went back to being silent. No wind, no footsteps, nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. But I didn't sleep that night. The second night the next day, I tried to push it out of my mind. I kept busy, hiking a few miles through the trees, trying to enjoy the quiet. The forest was beautiful, untouched, but the silence was unnatural. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my own footsteps. I found an old deer stand deep in the woods, its ladder rotted and broken. Nearby, I saw bones, small ones, probably from a rabbit or squirrel. They were picked clean, scattered in a strange pattern. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Nature was brutal and animals died out here all the time. But looking back, I should have left right then and there. That night, I locked the door and kept the fire low. I didn't want the light giving away my position. I sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps came back, closer this time. They circled the cabin, slow and steady, stopping every so often like they were listening. I held my breath, gripping the hunting knife I kept beside my bed. Then the voice called my name. I don't know how, but it knew my name. Sounded almost right, almost familiar, like someone I had known a long time ago. But there was something wrong with it. Too flat, too empty, like it was just repeating a sound it had heard before. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. Then a scratching sound, light, slow, like nails against wood. I stayed completely still. Then, just as suddenly as before, the sound stopped. The footsteps faded back into the woods. I barely slept that night. The third night, by the third day, I was on edge. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe some kind of predator. But predators didn't call your name in the dark. I decided to leave the next morning. That night, I didn't even bother with the fire. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, waiting. The footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved around the cabin, slow and steady, like whoever or whatever it was looking for a way in. Then the voice. But this time, it wasn't just my name. It repeated phrases I had said earlier in the cabin. Things I had whispered to myself. Things no one else could have heard. It was listening. I gripped the knife tighter, my heart pounding. Then came the worst part. It laughed. Not a normal laugh. A broken, jagged sound, like someone trying to copy a laugh without understanding what it meant. It sent a chill through my entire body. I knew then that I had to leave. At the first sign of daylight, I grabbed my bag and threw it into my truck. I didn't bother packing. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the mirror. Something stood at the tree line, tall, thin, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Even now, I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'm never going back. Hunting had been part of my life since I was old enough to carry a rifle. Growing up in a small town in Montana, spending time in the woods was second nature to me. I had hunted in different places over the years, but I always went back to the same spot deep in the mountains where my uncle had built a small hunting cabin decades ago. The place wasn't fancy, just a single-room structure made of old logs with a wood stove, a small cot, and some shelves stocked with dry goods. No electricity, no running water, just miles of dense forest all around. It was late November, right after Thanksgiving. The temperature had dropped, and snow had started sticking to the ground in the higher elevations. I had planned this trip for weeks, hoping to tag a big buck before winter really set in. I drove up the mountain as far as my truck would take me, then hiked the last 2 miles to the cabin, carrying my rifle, some supplies, and a heavy backpack. The air was crisp, the forest quiet, too quiet. Usually, I'd hear birds, squirrels, or at least the occasional snap of a branch from some animal moving through the trees. But as I walked, all I heard was the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and set my things down. The place smelled like old wood and dust, just as I remembered. Everything was the same except for one thing. The axe I always kept outside, propped against the chopping block, was gone. I frowned and looked around. It wasn't buried in the snow, and it hadn't fallen over. It was just missing. Maybe a bear or some other animal had dragged it off, but that didn't make much sense. Bears wouldn't be roaming around this time of year, not with winter coming. I shook it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. I set up my cot, got a fire going in the wood stove, and heated up some canned chili for dinner. After eating, I stepped outside to relieve myself and take in the night air. The sky was clear, full of stars. The moon cast long shadows over the snow-covered ground. That's when I noticed the tracks. They weren't deer tracks. They weren't bear tracks. They were boot prints, human, and they led from the tree line straight to my cabin. My stomach tightened. I followed the prints with my eyes. They stopped just a few feet from the door, then turned around and went back into the woods. Someone had walked up to the cabin, stood there for a while, and left. I didn't like it. This place was miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen another soul on my way in. No reason for anyone to be out here. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat in silence, listening. The fire crackled, but outside, everything was still. I grabbed my rifle and set it next to my cot before lying down. I barely slept, waking up every hour to listen for sounds outside. Morning came, gray and cold. I got up, threw on my jacket, and stepped outside. The boot prints were still there, untouched. I walked around the cabin, scanning the trees. I saw nothing, just the endless forest stretching in every direction. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent most of the day tracking, hoping to spot a buck, but something was off. I found tracks, deer, elk, even a few rabbit prints, but every time I settled in a spot, waiting for movement, the woods felt dead. No birds, no rustling of leaves, no signs of life. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. By late afternoon, I gave up and headed back to the cabin. I was uneasy, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I saw the axe. It was back, propped against the chopping block exactly where it had been before. I stood there staring at it. I hadn't overlooked it the night before. It was gone, and now it was back. I picked it up. It was clean. No snow, no dirt. Nothing to suggest it had been lying somewhere all night. Someone had taken it, and someone had put it back. I went inside, locked the door, and bolted it. My rifle was already loaded, but I double-checked. I wasn't about to let my guard down. As night fell, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I sat in the dim glow of the wood stove, listening. Hours passed. Nothing happened, until it did. A soft thump against the wall. Then another. It wasn't loud, just deliberate. I stood, heart pounding, rifle in hand. I moved toward the door as quietly as I could. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Then, just as I started to think it was my imagination, the doorknob turned. Not fast. Not like someone trying to force their way in. Just slow testing. I raised the rifle aimed at the door. My breath was shallow, my pulse hammering. The knob stopped turning. A long pause. Then, footsteps, slow, steady, moving away. I waited, barely breathing. After a while, I heard nothing but the crackling fire. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear and got ready to leave. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the trees. Nothing. The boot prints were back, leading up to the door and away again. But there was something else. A single, fresh boot print, right next to my own tracks, bigger than my foot, deep in the snow like someone had been standing there, watching. I turned and walked away, moving fast. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The whole way down the trail, I felt eyes on me. The hair on my neck stood up. My skin crawled. Every rustling branch, every snap of a twig made me jump. I gripped my rifle tight, ready for anything. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, got inside, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Then, just before I started the engine, I saw it. Through the trees, about 50 yards away, a figure, standing there motionless. Too far to make out details, but I knew one thing for certain. He was watching me. I didn't wait. I started the truck, spun the tires in the snow, and got the hell out of there. I never went back to that cabin. Never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those tracks. the axe, the slow turn of the doorknob, and I wonder, how long had he been watching before I ever noticed? It was late September when I drove deep into the Amazon rainforest in southern Peru. It wasn't my first time staying at a cabin in a remote area, but this was different. I had been hired by a conservation group to document local wildlife, so I planned to spend a few weeks alone, tracking animals and collecting data. The organization had arranged for me to stay in an old cabin owned by a biologist who had lived there for years but had moved out a few months earlier. The place was far from any main roads, deep inside the forest, reachable only by boat along a wide river. The boat ride itself took nearly 3 hours, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already setting. The cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by dense jungle. It had a tin roof, wooden walls, and a front porch with a few chairs. There was a shed beside it where old supplies were stored. Inside, it was simple. One room with a bed, a small table, and a shelf filled with old books and notes left behind by the biologist. A narrow door led to the back, where a tiny kitchen and bathroom were set up. There was a generator for electricity, but I had to use it sparingly since fuel was limited. I had brought plenty of food, water, and camping gear, just in case something went wrong. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking through the jungle, setting up motion-activated cameras, and logging my findings. At night, the sounds of the rainforest were almost overwhelming. Frogs, insects, birds, and distant howls of animals I couldn't identify. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, I found it refreshing. On the 5th night, the rain started. It began as a light drizzle in the evening, but by midnight, it had turned into a full-blown storm. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the walls of the cabin. Rain hammered against the roof so loudly that it drowned out every other sound. The air smelled of wet earth, and the temperature dropped slightly. I stayed inside, reading through some of the old notes on the shelf. Most of them were observations about the local wildlife, but a few mentioned strange things. Missing equipment, unexplained footprints near the cabin, and an entry that simply read, "There is something out here. I don't know what it is, but it watches at night." I assumed it was just paranoia. Living alone in a place like this for years could make anyone see things that weren't there. I went to bed around 1 a.m., but sleep didn't come easily. The storm made everything feel unstable, like the walls could collapse at any moment. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But the rain was so loud that it was impossible to be sure. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly to a loud bang. For a moment, I thought it was thunder, but as I sat up, I realized it had come from the front porch. The wind had died down, and the rain had softened into a steady drizzle. I listened, my heart pounding. There was another bang, this time more distinct, like wood hitting wood. I reached for my flashlight and crept toward the window. The glass was fogged up from the humidity, but I could make out something on the porch, a dark shape standing near the railing. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a jaguar, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a person, a man. He was standing completely still, facing the cabin. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see the outline of his body, tall, thin, wearing dark, soaked clothes. I stood there, frozen. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night during a storm miles away from any town? The man didn't move. He just stood there. I turned off my flashlight and backed away from the window, my mind racing. Maybe he was lost, maybe he needed help, but something about the way he just stood there made my skin crawl. I grabbed the machete I kept by my bed. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I forced myself to breathe slowly, listening. Then, I heard something that made my stomach drop. The doorknob rattled. Not a knock, not a call for help, just the sound of the metal turning, testing if it was unlocked. I gripped the machete tighter, then silence. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only a minute. Finally, I forced myself to move back toward the window. Slowly, I peeked outside again. The porch was empty. The man was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the bed with my machete in my lap, listening. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving outside, but I couldn't be sure. By morning, the rain had stopped. The forest was thick with mist, and everything was soaked. I stepped outside, machete still in hand, and checked the porch. There were footprints, barefoot, leading from the trees to my door. I followed them, my heart pounding. They went around the cabin, stopping near the back window. Then they disappeared into the jungle. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself it was just some lost traveler, but I knew that didn't make sense. No one traveled this deep into the jungle alone, especially not barefoot in the middle of a storm. That night, I locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, and kept my machete beside me. But nothing happened. No sounds, no movements. The following morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care about finishing my research. I didn't want to know who that man was or what he wanted. When I got back to town, I told the conservation group that I wasn't feeling well and had to cut my trip short. They didn't ask many questions. Before I left, I mentioned the old biologist who had lived there before me. I asked if anyone knew why he had moved out. The man at the office shrugged. He just said he wasn't alone out there. I remember that weekend too well. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip, a short getaway to my cousin Daniel's cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. Daniel was a scientist, always talking about his research, and his wife, Lauren, was a cop, tough as nails and never easily scared. Her stepmother, Marlene, was with us too, a quiet woman in her late 50s who mostly kept to herself. The four of us had planned this trip for months. Daniel insisted the location was perfect, secluded, peaceful, surrounded by nature. The cabin itself wasn't too fancy, just a 2-bedroom structure with a small living room and a wood stove for heating. No electricity, no running water, just a well outside and a generator that barely worked. The nearest town was over 40 miles away, and once you took the dirt road into the woods, you wouldn't see another house for miles. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sun was setting as we unloaded our gear. The air smelled fresh, pine and damp earth, and there was a stillness in the trees that felt almost too quiet. I didn't think much of it then. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected. Small but cozy, a few old furniture pieces, a fireplace with a stack of wood beside it, and a couple of cots set up in the back room. Daniel had brought all kinds of supplies, canned food, bottled water, a propane stove. He was prepared for a weekend of roughing it. That first night, everything seemed normal. We ate dinner, played some cards, and talked late into the night. It wasn't until I got up to use the outhouse that I noticed something strange. The forest was silent, completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. I remember standing there, feeling a weird tightness in my chest. I had spent time in the woods before, and I knew that even at night, there was always some noise. Frogs, crickets, the occasional owl. But this was unnatural. I shook it off and went back inside. The next morning, Daniel wanted to hike to a stream a couple of miles away. He had some samples he wanted to collect, something about water quality research. Lauren and I went with him, leaving Marlene behind at the cabin. She wasn't much of an outdoors person, and she said she'd rather read and relax. The hike was uneventful at first. The forest was thick, the ground damp from recent rain, and the trees loomed high above us, blocking most of the sky. We followed an old trail, barely visible beneath the overgrowth. Then we found something, a shoe. It was just sitting there in the dirt, half buried. A hiking boot, worn but still intact. Daniel picked it up, turning it over in his hands. There was dried mud on it, but no real sign of damage. We looked around, but there was nothing else. No footprints, no torn clothing, nothing to suggest that someone had lost it recently. Maybe someone passed through here a long time ago, I said, though I felt uneasy. We kept walking. A mile later, we found another item, a torn backpack, faded and covered in moss. It looked like it had been there for years, but something about it was off. There were no signs of animal damage, no scratches or bite marks, just torn, like it had been ripped open by something. At that point, I was starting to feel uneasy. Lauren was too. She kept scanning the trees, her hand resting near the knife she always carried on her belt. Then we found the campsite. It was old, long abandoned, but it was clear that someone had stayed there once. A rusted-out fire pit, a few collapsed tent poles, and the remains of a sleeping bag. But what really got me was the way everything was scattered. It didn't look like someone had just left. It looked like they had run. Daniel took a few samples from the stream, and we left. None of us spoke much on the way back. When we returned, Marlene was standing on the porch, looking pale. She told us that while we were gone, she had heard something, footsteps, circling the cabin. At first, she thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but then she realized the steps were too slow, too deliberate. She had locked the door and stayed inside until we came back. That night, things got worse. We went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me tense up. The wind had started to pick up, and the trees groaned under its weight. Around midnight, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. Twigs snapping, slow, careful movement just beyond the tree line. But then it stopped, and a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer. I held my breath, listening. Then came the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I lay there, frozen. Then the door handle rattled. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it toward the door. The sound stopped. A few minutes passed. Then I heard something move away, back into the woods. The next morning, Daniel found footprints in the dirt around the cabin.
Bare footprints.
Not animal tracks, not boots, bare feet. We packed up and left. None of us spoke much on the way back. Later, we looked up missing persons reports from the area. There were a few. Hikers, campers, people who had vanished without a trace. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to. It was late October, and I was alone in a small, rustic cabin I had rented in the woods of northern Michigan. I had come up here to get away from everything. The city noise, the never-ending work emails, the obligations of daily life. The plan was to spend a few days hiking, reading, and just getting some much-needed peace. The cabin was simple, with a single bedroom, a small living area with a stone fireplace, and a kitchenette. Nothing fancy, but it felt cozy enough. I had arrived a few hours before sunset, and as the last light of day faded into the horizon, the air turned cool. I made a quick dinner, some pasta with tomato sauce, and set it down at the small wooden table by the window. I had a good view of the woods beyond, just a mix of trees stretching into the distance. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of distant animals. By the time the sky darkened, I was sitting in front of the fireplace, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the crackling of the fire filling the otherwise silent room. I was reading a book, occasionally looking out the window to see the moon rising high. The The woods felt peaceful, calming even, but there was something off about the place. It was hard to explain. The silence felt too heavy at times, like something was just waiting, watching, but whenever I shook off the feeling and focused on my book, the night felt normal again. I had been there for 2 days already and hadn't seen another person. The nearest town was about an hour's drive away, and aside from the occasional deer or raccoon, I hadn't run into anyone else. That suited me just fine. I liked being alone in the woods, but that night, things started to feel different. It was just after midnight when I first heard it. A soft knocking at the door. 3 slow taps, like someone gently tapping on the wood. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out here at this hour? I froze for a moment, listening. There was no wind, no trees rattling against the cabin, just the sound of the knocks. I couldn't explain why, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I stood up cautiously and walked to the door. My first thought was to check the window, but it was dark outside, and the forest seemed even quieter than usual. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, just the faint hum of the wind through the trees. It was then that I noticed it, the small, twisted shadow near the edge of the trees. I thought I saw something, a figure standing just at the edge of the darkness. But when I blinked, it was gone. The knocking continued. 3 taps, then nothing. I considered not answering it. What if it was just someone playing a prank or a lost hiker looking for directions? But who would be out here at this hour in the woods, miles away from the nearest trail or road? I slowly opened the door, half expecting to see no one. But when the door creaked open, I saw her, a woman, standing in front of me, just a few feet away. She wasn't tall, maybe just a little shorter than me, with long, tangled black hair that hung around her face like a curtain. She was dressed in a worn-out white dress that looked out of place in the middle of the woods. Her bare feet were caked in dirt, and she was standing unnaturally still, just staring at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at her. There was something strange about her appearance. Her eyes were too wide, almost unnaturally so, and her face was pale, like she hadn't seen the sun in years. There was a faint, unsettling smell of decay in the air, like rotting wood or mold, and it made my stomach turn. The woman didn't speak, didn't move. She just stood there, watching me, like she had been waiting for me to open the door. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice coming out shaky. I didn't want to seem scared, but the tension in the air was suffocating. She didn't respond. I stepped back, instinctively pulling the door more fully open as if that might give me some space. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was a local who had wandered off the trail. But the longer I looked at her, the more I felt that something was terribly wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I had the overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't let her in, that something in my gut was screaming at me to stay away. I closed the door slightly, trying to shield myself from the strange woman. But the knocking came again, harder this time, a loud thud that made the whole door rattle. I could feel my pulse racing in my chest. Why was she doing this? A cold chill ran down my spine, and without thinking, I bolted the door shut. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. What was going on? Was she alone? Was anyone else out there with her? I quickly scanned the area through the window but saw nothing. The trees were dark and still, nothing moving in the shadows. I didn't sleep much that night. The fear lingered in my mind, keeping me awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I kept hearing noises, scratching, soft tapping, like something was trying to get in. But whenever I looked, there was nothing. The silence was suffocating. The next morning, I woke up to the bright light of the sun streaming through the windows. It felt like a relief after the tension of the night before. I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it all, that I had been overreacting. The woman, the knocking, it all felt like a strange dream, like it had never really happened. I spent the day out on the trails, hiking along the narrow paths that wound through the forest. The sun was out, and the weather was cool but bearable. But when I returned to the cabin later that afternoon, something wasn't right. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to notice. I had locked it before I left. I was sure of it. My heart began to race again as I stepped inside. Nothing seemed disturbed, except for a single muddy footprint just inside the door. It wasn't mine. I didn't want to go any further, but I forced myself to take a step, then another. I could feel my body shaking as I slowly moved toward the bedroom. I didn't want to find anything, but I knew I had to check. The room was exactly as I had left it. The bed neatly made, the window closed. But then, my eyes fell on the dresser in the corner. There was a smear of something on the wood, a dark streak that hadn't been there before. I walked over to it, my stomach twisting. It was some kind of dried, dark substance. Blood? I wasn't sure, but the thought made my blood run cold. I backed away from the dresser, feeling the overwhelming urge to leave, to get out of there. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the windows. Felt like I was being watched. I grabbed my jacket, not bothering to pack anything else. I was leaving, but as I stepped outside, I froze. There, standing in the trees just beyond the cabin's small porch, was the woman. She was even closer this time, her figure barely visible in the fading light. Her wide eyes were locked onto mine, and I could feel the same overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. There was no way she could have followed me. The path I had taken that afternoon was miles away from here, and there was no trail leading to the cabin. Without thinking, I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned as I pushed myself faster. The air around me seemed to grow colder with every step, and I could hear something moving behind me. Something was chasing me, keeping pace, but I refused to look back. Couldn't. If I looked back, I knew I wouldn't be able to stop running. I ran for what felt like hours, my mind barely able to keep up with my body's frantic movements. I don't know how long I was out there, but eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing. That's when I heard it. The sound of heavy breathing, slow and steady, just behind me. I turned around, my heart nearly stopping. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was the woman. Her eyes were wide, her mouth twisted into a sickening smile. She was still watching me, but this time she wasn't moving. She was just standing there, silent, waiting. And then, without another word, she disappeared into the shadows of the trees, as if she had never been there. I didn't look back again. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where I finally flagged down a passing car. I didn't explain what happened. I didn't need to. I just wanted to get away. The cabin is still out there, sitting in those woods, but I'll never go back. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still see her, those wide eyes, that pale face, waiting in the trees, watching, always watching. I had never been a fan of the quiet. To be honest, the idea of a cabin in the middle of nowhere had always sounded too lonely, too isolating. But after the breakup and the endless city noise gnawing at my brain, I thought a week in the woods might give me the peace I needed to reset. A change of scenery, away from everything I knew, seemed like the best option. I rented a small cabin in the woods up in northern Idaho, somewhere tucked deep into the mountain range. The kind of place you'd never find unless you were actively looking for it. The cabin was old, probably built in the 70s, and I wasn't sure if it had been updated since then. The place was simple, but that was all I needed. One room with a loft upstairs, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove. I figured it was just what I needed to get away from everything for a few days. I drove up alone, planning to spend my time reading, hiking, and avoiding the thoughts that had been creeping into my mind ever since I'd moved out of the apartment. The first day was peaceful. The hike up to the cabin had been longer than expected, and the rough road didn't help matters. But once I got there, unpacked, and lit a fire in the stove, everything felt like it was falling into place. The view from the porch was breathtaking. The sun setting behind the mountain peaks, the trees whispering with the light breeze. But as the darkness came, so did the silence. I'm not talking about the usual quiet of the woods. I mean the type of silence where you can hear your own pulse in your ears, the kind that creeps into your mind, pulling you out of your comfort zone. I remember sitting on the porch that night, sipping on some coffee and watching the stars, when I started feeling like something was off. It wasn't a specific sound or sight, but a gut feeling that there was something about the woods, something about this place that wasn't quite right. It was the kind of feeling that made the back of your neck prickle, but nothing in particular seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake it. The next few days, I kept busy. I explored the surrounding woods, hiking for miles and trying to get lost in the beauty of the landscape. But the unsettling feeling never fully left. It was like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, nothing was there. I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me, probably just too much time spent alone, but it didn't feel like that. It was something deeper, something harder to ignore. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a noise from outside, a crack like a branch snapping. I froze. The wind had been calm all day, and the trees were still. It wasn't like anything I had heard before. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart racing, and stepped outside onto the porch, scanning the darkened forest. I tried to calm myself down. It was probably an animal, a deer or something else harmless. But then the noise came again. Another crack, but this time closer. I stood still, barely breathing, my flashlight sweeping through the trees. Nothing. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, then retreated back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. The rest of that night passed uneventfully, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, had me jumping out of my skin. I kept the light on by my bed, a small comfort in the growing darkness. The thought that I could just leave and go back to the city crept into my mind, but I refused. I was here for a reason. I needed this time, no matter how uncomfortable it got. The next morning, I decided to explore farther than I had before. I had a trail in mind that led up a ridge, offering a view of the valley below. It was a popular trail, and I figured it would take my mind off things. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and my camera, and set out early. The forest was dense, the kind of thick woods where the sunlight barely touched the ground. The air was cool, and the smell of pine was thick. I made my way up the trail, trying to focus on the beauty around me, the serenity of it all. But every so often, I'd stop, feeling that gnawing sensation in my gut again, the sense that someone was out there with me. I pushed on, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I climbed higher, I found something unusual. It was a small clearing, not on the trail map I had, and in the center of it was an old, dilapidated shack. It didn't look like it had been used in years. The wood was rotting, the roof sagging, and there was no sign of life around it. I approached it cautiously. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the air around it felt thick, almost suffocating. I stepped inside, my flashlight illuminating the empty, decaying interior. Old furniture, covered in layers of dust, sat scattered around. There was a stove in the corner, and what appeared to be a makeshift bed. But the strangest thing was a small, wooden chest tucked under the bed. It didn't look old like the rest of the place. It was pristine, almost out of place. I debated whether or not to open it. but curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down, brushing off the dust, and opened the chest. Inside was a stack of papers, yellowed with age. I flipped through them, my hands shaking slightly. They were mostly blank, but some had strange symbols scribbled across them, patterns that didn't make any sense to me. A shiver ran down my spine. Something about the shack, the chest, those papers, it all felt wrong. I snapped the chest closed and backed away. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard something behind me, the sound of footsteps on the floor. I spun around, flashlight flicking in every direction, but there was nothing there, just the dead silence of the forest. I quickly left the shack and continued up the trail, my heart pounding. I tried to shake off the unease, but the image of the chest stayed with me. It felt like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. But what was it? That night after dinner, I decided to lock all the doors and windows again. The wind had started howling outside, and I felt safer inside, where I could keep an eye on things. But as I sat by the fire, I heard it again, the same snap of a branch. This time it was closer than before. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way outside, every nerve in my body on edge. The woods seemed so still, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just out of sight, watching. I stood outside for several minutes, my heart thudding in my chest. But there was nothing, just the wind, the rustling of leaves, the distant sounds of the night. The days that followed were filled with more of the same. Strange noises, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something wasn't right. But I couldn't figure out what it was. One afternoon, while I was sitting outside, trying to make sense of everything, I noticed something different in the woods. A small trail, barely noticeable, snaking off into the trees. It wasn't on any map I had, and it didn't look like it had been used recently. But something pulled me toward it. I followed the trail, deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, and the air felt heavier, like the forest was closing in around me. After what seemed like hours, I finally reached a clearing. In the center was a large rock, and near it, buried under some leaves, was a piece of old cloth. I bent down to pick it up, and as I did, I noticed something strange. There were symbols on the fabric, identical to the ones on the papers from the shack. My stomach twisted. I looked around, the unsettling feeling intensifying. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then I heard it, a voice, soft but clear. "Leave." I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice hadn't come from anywhere near me. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees. I bolted back down the trail, fear surging through me. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. That night, I locked everything up again, keeping every light on. I couldn't get the voice out of my head. What was it? Who was it? And why was I hearing it? The next morning, I packed up my things. I had enough. The cabin was no longer peaceful, and I had felt that strange presence for too long. I left the key on the kitchen table, not bothering to lock up. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I drove away, the feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't just the forest or the cabin. It was everything, the air, the trees, the roads. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. I don't know what happened there, what I stumbled across in those woods, but I know this. I'll never return to that cabin. Never again. I was 28 when I decided to take a solo trip to Australia. The plan was simple: head to the remote outback, hike, and disconnect for a few days. I wasn't looking for adventure, not at first. I just wanted a quiet escape, away from everything: work, city noise, the endless distractions of modern life. So, I booked a small cabin in the middle of nowhere, nestled in the foothills of the Grampians National Park. The cabin was basic, tucked away down a dirt road, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just a few old pine trees surrounding the place and nothing else. Perfect, I thought. The air was dry, warm, and crisp, and the occasional bird call or rustle in the trees was the only thing that broke the silence. I arrived just before dusk. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cabin looked exactly as it had in the pictures, rustic and simple, with a porch that faced out toward the thick forest. The place had been around for decades, and everything about it gave off that worn-in feeling, as if the cabin had been there long before I'd even thought to come. Inside, the wooden floors creaked underfoot, the smell of pine and old firewood in the air. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a single bed, a small table by the window, and a fireplace along the far wall. A few photos of the surrounding mountains decorated the walls, giving the place a sense of homeliness. I spent the first evening settling in, lighting a fire to keep the chill at bay. It felt peaceful, maybe even a little too peaceful. I'd hiked earlier in the day, and after a quick dinner of canned soup, I headed outside to enjoy the clear sky. The stars were bright, far more visible than they ever were back home. But as the night wore on, the isolation started to sink in. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was unnerving. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just overthinking. I'd spent plenty of time alone before, but something about this place felt different. The air was thick, heavy, as if the land itself was waiting for something. Or maybe it was just me. I went to bed early, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear my head, but sleep never came. It was the kind of restless night where your mind won't settle, where every creak of the floorboards and whistle of the wind seems too loud, too deliberate. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, a soft tap at the cabin door. I froze, holding my breath. I thought it was just the wind at first, but then it came again. This time a little louder, more distinct. My heart started to race. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The tapping stopped, replaced by a long, drawn-out scrape, like nails running across metal. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The front door? The window? I told myself it was just some animal. Possum, maybe, or a wallaby. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and cautiously made my way toward the door. There was no way I was opening it, not now, but I needed to see what was out there. I swung the light toward the window, then slowly swept it across the porch, the beam illuminating the empty yard. Nothing. The trees swayed lightly in the breeze, but nothing out of the ordinary. Relieved, I locked the door and returned to bed, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I didn't fall asleep until after dawn, and by the time the first light crept through the trees, I was exhausted. The next day, I decided to explore. There were plenty of trails nearby, so I figured I'd get some fresh air and distract myself from the unease of the night. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a map, and set off into the dense brush. The landscape was stunning. Rugged hills, deep ravines, and patches of dry creek beds. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone, or something, was just out of sight, watching me. I hiked for hours, stopping only for short breaks. The further I went, the more I noticed strange things. A pile of branches stacked neatly in the middle of the trail. Footprints in the dirt, but they didn't look like animal tracks. They were too big, too deep, as if someone had been walking around barefoot. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that maybe I was just being paranoid. By the time I turned back, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the land. I was still a good 45 minutes from the cabin, but I figured I had enough time to make it back before dark. As I walked, the unease grew stronger. There was a crunch behind me, like footsteps in the gravel. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. I tried to call out, but my voice felt small, swallowed up by the wide open space. My legs were aching, my breath shallow as I picked up the pace. Every step felt like I was being chased, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with every rustle of the leaves or snap of a twig. I finally reached the cabin just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple. That night, I locked every door and window. I made sure the fire was going strong, and I kept the flashlight next to me as I sat on the couch, my eyes darting to the window every few minutes. But there was nothing. The forest was still, silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire. As the hours passed, I started to relax, telling myself that I was just imagining things. I dozed off on the couch, exhausted from the long day. It was a deep sleep, but not peaceful. I woke with a start, my heart hammering in my chest. It was the same sound, the tapping at the door, followed by that scraping noise. This time it was louder, closer. I jumped up, grabbing the flashlight and cautiously moving toward the door. The porch was empty, but something felt wrong. The air was heavy again, thick with an oppressive stillness. I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my ears, and then I saw it. Something dark in the shadows, barely visible against the trees. It was a figure, standing motionless just outside the light's reach. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't moving. I felt my stomach twist in fear, the realization sinking in. I wasn't alone out here. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a neighbor, someone else staying nearby, though I'd seen no signs of anyone else around when I arrived. But the feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't leave me. The night stretched on, the tapping stopping, but that feeling of being watched never going away. I didn't sleep much, my mind racing with possibilities, trying to think of any logical explanation. But nothing fit. The next morning, I packed up my things early. I couldn't stay another night. As I stepped outside to load the car, I noticed something strange by the front door. A footprint large and deep in the dirt, leading up to the cabin. It wasn't there the night before. I didn't know who or what it belonged to, but it was enough to convince me that I had overstayed my welcome. I didn't look back as I drove down the dusty road, the cabin growing smaller in my rearview mirror. My hands were shaking, my mind still replaying every moment, every noise I'd heard. I had been looking for peace, but all I found was a place that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. A place that didn't want anyone to stay too long. I didn't return to the Grampians. Not then, and I haven't since.